want to thank everyone for showing up. We got the recording going. Okay. I want to thank everyone for showing up. I think this is an important discussion, a needed discussion. The New York Times or the Washington Post had a big story about the situation with journalists a few days ago, which I was glad to see. I'm going to take a minute or two to talk about something else. This is the anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 1944, when our troops stormed Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, and what have you. And this is also on June 4th, 1940 was the anniversary. It was when Dunkirk occurred, when the British and French escaped the beaches of Dunkirk. People don't understand, unless they are World War II buffs, how fortunate we were in those two things. If the Germans had done what they were supposed to do, we would be living in a vastly different society. They could have mowed down and captured all the British and French troops, and Hitler could have released his panzers when we got to the beaches on D-Day. My half brother landed on Omaha Beach on his 24th birthday. So this is kind of personal to me. So let's don't take this thing about democracy for granted, because we're being threatened now. And I think tonight's discussion will probably highlight some of these threats. Thank you.
Okay, Louisa, you're muted.
Louisa, I muted you. I'm sorry.
Can you unmute?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, Ruth. Yeah, just a brief treasurer's report. We received, through the month of May, we received 2 new memberships, and we've had no expenses, and our new balance is $1155.23. So we're in pretty good shape. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Louisa. So I want to welcome all of you folks. I'm Mohammed Nasrullah. I'm the current president of this Amnesty International local chapter number 1017. I want to thank all the 3 panelists, Lisa, Elle, and Katherine, for agreeing to be on the panel for today. The title of today's discussion is Attack on Journalists and Journalism, and the panel discussion will be moderated by Ruth Nasrullah, who is the current president of the Society for Professional Journalists, Houston chapter, and she's also a freelance journalist, and she's my boss number 2. So Ruth, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Wait, who's boss number 1? Hold on. Welcome, everyone. Actually, Mohammed, since you're co-host, can you please admit people while I'm talking? Okay, thanks. I just want to start by welcoming all of you, and also I'd like to acknowledge 2 of our Houston SPJ board members are here, Jim McGill and Dwayne Bradley. If you can wait for the camera, thank you for being here. They work hard all year helping Houston SPJ be as dynamic and interesting as it is. I hope the members feel the same way. So tonight, we're going to have some experts talking about a really timely topic. Unfortunately, it continues to be timely and relevant all around the world, and that's, as the title says, attacks on journalists and journalism. So I'm going to start by just asking each of our panelists to introduce yourself, your work, what you do, and what you think the most pressing issue, if you can come up with just one that's the biggest challenge for the area that you work in. And I'd like to start with Lisa Konczal, who is the Nicaragua country specialist for Amnesty International USA. She's also a professor of sociology and criminology at Barry University in Miami. And as a country specialist for Amnesty, Lisa documents human rights violations in Nicaragua including attacks on journalists, and provides declarations and testimony in immigration court on behalf of asylum seekers fleeing Nicaragua due to persecution. And we've had several sessions in this Amnesty chapter about people from Central America fleeing persecution. Lisa received her PhD from Florida International University and did postdoctoral research with the Center for Migration and Development at Princeton. And Lisa, take it away, please.
All right. Well, thank you, Ruth and Mohammed and the rest of you for putting on this event. It's rights of journalists, I think, is the cornerstone to promoting human rights in general. They're human rights defenders. And I'll talk a little more about Nicaragua, which is my specialty, a little bit later, but I think some of you may be familiar with what is going on there since about the spring of 2018. You saw so many government attacks on peaceful protesters that were just, speaking out against their government. There were mass killings, arbitrary arrests, disappearances. Those continue today. And the government, the main group that they target is journalists, because they know that that is the voice that will expose the government, or expose the government's really very violent human rights violations. I don't know if there's any, I know we're going to talk more about the, okay. Was that enough or should
I think so. We're going to get into the meat of it as we go along. So with
Okay.
that, I would like to introduce our next panelist. Katherine Jacobsen is the U.S. and Canada Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists, a global nonprofit organization based in New York. In this role, Jacobsen works with local news organizations and reporters to monitor and respond to attacks on the media. Prior to working at CPJ, Jacobsen worked for 4 years as a reporter in Ukraine and Russia, writing for outlets including the Associated Press and Business Week. So, Katherine.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me. It's great to speak with you all. So just a little bit about the Committee to Protect Journalists and my role at the organization. As Ruth said, I cover the US and Canada, and the Committee to Protect Journalists has 3 different kind of main departments. So there are regional programs, which I'm part of that. We do research on all of the different problems that journalists face around the world and keep track of all of these different issues. We work very closely with our advocacy team that strategizes about how to try and make things better for journalists, which is, a very kind of uphill battle sometimes, you might say. And then we have the emergencies team, which does rapid response to quickly evolving geopolitical events that put journalists in danger. So examples of that are with Afghanistan. We did a lot of work to try and get as many reporters as we possibly could out of the country following the US troop pullout. And then more recently, we've been responding to the invasion of Ukraine, May 24th, or sorry, the February invasion of Ukraine, and the changing security situation on the ground for Ukrainian journalists, as well as the outflowing of Russian independent media, with more kind of repressive anti-media laws passed following that invasion. I kind of get roped in to work on some of the emergency response stuff, but a lot of the time my work focuses on kind of the granular things in the United States, kind of slow burn, if you will, that the journalists face working across the country. And also in Canada, I should add, kind of the land of milk and honey north of us is usually viewed as a place with, very few press freedom issues, but unfortunately we're starting to see there as well, kind of, again, the slow ebb of problems kind of sneaking up. So yeah, I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Katherine. And finally, we have Elle Toussi, who is a journalist and producer based out of Southern California, and she serves as the the co-chair of the Society of Professional Journalists International Community, and she's also on the board of the Freelancers Union. You can see her investigative work in the New York Times and reporting on BBC Panorama, CNN, and PRI, The World, to just name a few outlets. As a cross-platform journalist, she has covered sexual abuse cases in sports, all the way to refugee coverage in the Middle East. And unfortunately, I have to find her on my screens. Oh, hang on, Elle. My screen changed. Elle, wave your hand. So there you are. Okay. So please go ahead, Elle. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much for having me. It's honestly, it's an honor to be with Katherine and Lisa talking about this subject today. Just to go over my role with international community at SPJ, really this community came about because it's actually an extension of SPJ for those of us that are really interested in protecting journalism globally. And I encourage those of you that are in the Houston chapter, if this is something that you're interested in, we would love to have you be involved. We're constantly having more members from different national chapters joining us in this endeavor, where we like to protect international journalism, especially press freedom. For me personally, I know we're supposed to discuss issues or matters that we think are very pressing right now. And as a journalist right now, working on a few different stories, I think the most pressing things right now is freedom of information, access thereto for journalists. And this is not just for those that are international. Working on a story in Alabama where, being in California, I don't have the access to the freedom of information or the information that should be I have access to. And this is something that should be a concern for everyone. You know, the access to this type of information should be available. And second thing that has always been a part of my involvement with the international community is safety. And has always been in the thread of everything that I do with the organization. And within the last year, within the international community, have formed a partnership where we provide free risk assessments for freelancers that are SPJ members. So I hope that if you in the Houston chapter have any freelance journalists or paid members that are working on stories that whatever location they plan on going to, even if they're local, please join that effort where we can do that risk assessment for you. You don't have to go to a different country to do it. You know, you can be working on a local story, and making sure that you do it safely, I think, is one of the most important things. So yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much. And Elle, I'm actually going to stay with you for a moment. One of the most dramatic cases that we've seen of violence against journalists recently was in the Palestinian occupied territories, the death of Shireen Abu Akleh. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit from your perspective as the head of the SPJ international community. Tell me, you know, what you think about that, what your stance is on it, and so forth, whatever you want to say.
Well, I think that what happened to Shireen is horrendous, and it should be something that I think any journalist, no matter where you're located, it should capture your attention, and you should stand up for the fact that something like this should never happen to a journalist doing their job, period. It shouldn't get to the point where someone's life is in danger. And I think with my involvement with the international community, Dan, my co-chair, we also have another member, Robert Buckman, who every time in the last 2 years or so, I was actually floored by the amount of press releases and information we'd send to headquarters, letting them know, can you please support this? This is happening abroad to a journalist, whether it's their life is in danger or there needs to be attention. And I think what happened to Shireen is something that is of importance for us to draw attention to.
Thanks. And Katherine, I'd actually like to go to you next because I am dying to know. Sorry, my screen keeps changing because I'm doing this highlighting thing. So, all right. So what I want to ask you, Katherine, is I just assume that everything is absolutely perfect in Canada. So what are the problems that facing journalists in Canada? It's just like
that's quite the shift going from the occupied Palestinian territories to Canada.
and you know, you can certainly comment on that as well if you'd like. So yeah, having a conversation.
Yeah, no, a lot of the problems that that CPJ has dealt with are actually access to information, as were mentioned in introductions as well. The arrests that we have documented have all been around pipeline protests, kind of akin to Standing Rock, if you guys recall that, way back when, in like 2017, I want to say. Where journalists have gone out to cover First Nation issues and First Nation protests around the construction of pipelines on their territories. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the local law enforcement, does not like that. And they have either arrested or detained journalists, trying basically just to block coverage, right? I mean, it's the same tactic that we've seen in the United States as well. The point is not to actually press charges against journalists and take them to court, though that sometimes happens and is a consequence of it if there's someone who wants to make a political point, but it's more just to make sure the coverage doesn't happen in general, right? Because you can't report the news if you're not there. If no one's there to document anything, nothing happened, right? So that's kind of the main issue. And then they also have backed up freedom of information requests, that sort of thing. So yeah, it kind of feels like the United States, the same issues that we saw in the United States, like,
Yeah.
what, 5-7 years ago.
Yeah. Well, thank you. If everyone who's not speaking can mute yourself, please. And Lisa, I'm gonna come to you next. And I guess you said that the main target of the government is journalists. And I wondered if you could just expand on that a little bit more, like how is the way the press functions and the rules surrounding it and the laws governing it this very similar to that in the US, or what's it like in Nicaragua?
I think it's much more serious in Nicaragua, but it could serve certainly as a lesson for, how to avoid really killing democracy. In Nicaragua, well, I think Katherine and Elle put it very nicely that, there's attacks on journalists, threatening them, even, reacting with violence against them is a way of silencing them so they don't expose the human rights violations that governments impose on their people. So in Nicaragua, when I said that journalists are the main targets, really it's the civil society, who are speaking out against the government are the main targets. But authoritarian dictators know that it's the journalists who are going to speak up for civil society. In Nicaragua, I mentioned a key time that was in the summer of 2018, where you had so many people protesting on the streets. They were met with violence. You even had a freelance journalist on camera being killed. Okay. After that, the government started to impose another tactic, and that was to create laws that could silence journalists. And we've seen this as a trend in Central America, other parts of the world as well. One of the laws is the special law on cybercrime, which actually makes it illegal for people to post anything online that may cause harm, fear, or anxiety. So very arbitrary. Another law is the foreign agents law that they passed. They passed a similar one in El Salvador. And again, that's been used to silence journalists. It's kind of how it sounds. Any organization who has connections with a foreign country, and that could include getting charity or even working with other journalists around the world. They have to register with the government, and they're kind of giving the government permission to look over them, and the government in Nicaragua can decide to shut them down if they think, there's too much of a cozy relationship with another country. Because of laws like these, you've had, for example, recently, the chairman of La Prensa, which was one of the largest independent news organizations in Nicaragua. He was sentenced to several years in prison, I believe 9 years in prison just last month. Same with another one, Miguel Mora, sentenced to 13 years a couple months ago. He was a journalist just for speaking against the government. Okay. So definitely tactics like these, they're used by people like President Ortega, who's really an authoritarian government.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
I think Elle has her hand up. Did you?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I just wanted to piggyback off of what Lisa just mentioned, because it reminded me of one of the speakers we had in our IC talks during the beginning of the pandemic, where we would host these talks with journalists around the world. And it reminded me of Maria Ressa, who is in the Philippines, and talk about an authoritative government really taking over and trying to break her spirit. I mean, just having those conversations with her as a journalist to journalist, and having the group being a journalist connecting with her, you can see what toll it takes for those that are operating in a government, like in Philippines, like in Nicaragua. I mean, I would even say even Mexico, where lots of journalists are being killed, even just this year. Just around the world, we're seeing the governments are kind of coming up and taking this stance of trying to silence journalists. So it's really important to kind of shine a light to that.
Yeah. Elle and Katherine, I have a question that I'd like both of you to give your perspective on, if you'd like to. And that's Ukraine. And Katherine, because you worked as a reporter in Ukraine, and Elle, of course, because you're with the international community. So tell us what's going on there as far as press coverage and journalist safety, if you can comment.
Yeah, so actually, I took a brief leave of absence from US and Canada to work for a while, and was kind of chipped in with the Europe team, and was focusing primarily on our emergency response in Ukraine and Russia, and was over in Europe to deal with that. The situation in Ukraine is interesting in that all of these reporters across the country have overnight become war correspondents. I think it was easy for us to forget that there has been kind of a conflict in the East since 2014, following the annexation of Crimea, and then with the kind of hot and cold conflict in Donbass. So journalists had, been war correspondents for a while in that sense, but overnight, towns all across the country were basically turned into war zones, and there was a massive influx of need for flak jackets, helmets, and just equipment, right? If like TV towers were targeted by the Russians, or not targeted, but were hit by the Russians, and destroyed equipment and laptops, and just kind of the nitty-gritty things that you need to operate a newsroom. So that's going on. And then I think it's also really important to address the press freedom issues going on in Russia. And as we've documented, it's kind of this onslaught or has been kind of like a frog in the boiling water, I think. The situation has been getting worse and worse and worse for years. And finally, it kind of reached what I would call a boiling point almost following the invasion of Ukraine in February, when a law was passed by the State Duma, basically saying that if you published what the state deemed to be false information about the military at any point, you could face up to 15 years in prison, which of course any independent journalist who has ever mentioned the military in any setting could then be held liable for that. So there's been a massive influx, and they're trying to regroup to figure out what their newsrooms and reporting can look like from outside of the country. So those are kind of the two things.
Wow, thanks. Elle?
I think Katherine covered it really well. And from our perspective, we actually, we've had members, freelancers that reached out to us for support. That are planning on going out to Ukraine. And as the international community, as I mentioned earlier, one thing for us, and especially for myself, is always making sure that we can provide risk assessments, making sure that whichever journalist decides to go to a foreign country, they do that safely. And across the board, when we consulted with a lot of our partners, you know, we were getting that pushback as to make sure that unless they're with a news agency, confirm with a news agency, make sure they don't go in as a freelancer. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. I think in general, as journalists, myself included, in the beginning of my career, anytime I heard that there was something going on around the world, I wanted to be the first person there. And I think it's important now to really stress the importance of take a moment, take a breath. If you're not, if you don't have the proper equipment, proper assessments, the situation now going abroad in places like this can be very dire and for many fatal. So I hope that if you do talk to any members within your chapter, that you do let them know that if they do decide to go abroad in certain locations, that they do take the proper steps to do so.
What does your risk assessment consist of? What do you evaluate?
Well, I think it's interesting. So we've teamed up with a company called RiskPal, and I think CPJ, actually CPJ and there's another organization, Frontline Freelance, were the ones that referred me to RiskPal. And they essentially provide a service where wherever you decide to go, you enter your information, and they have someone look over that information to let you know what risks you need to assess to make sure to address it before you go. And I can't necessarily say what it would be. It would be better to do like a scenario, and I can go over that, but because for each location, it's different. So if I was going somewhere, it would, my nationality, where I'm located, what I look like, these are all a part of my risk assessment. If I'm going to the Middle East, or if I'm going to the Ukraine or going to Nicaragua, the risk assessments would be different, you know, and depending on if you're going in with a team, you have to assess your team and who they are and what they're getting into and what you need to think about. I can't stress enough how important it is if there is an opportunity to sign up for HEFAT training. I just recently did that maybe a couple months ago as a refresher. Those opportunities that are available, it's really important to do so because they are constantly staying updated as to what the risks are and making sure that you're equipped for it to the best of their capabilities. So
thanks. And Lisa, refugees and migrants were mentioned. And I was just wondering, do the plight of people who end up, you know, fleeing to go to another country, is that covered at all in the press in Nicaragua?
A lot is not covered in the press in Nicaragua right now, unless it's favorable to President Ortega. But you know that I hosted a World Press Freedom Day panel where we had a lot of journalists, not just from Nicaragua, but other areas of the world, that said that they themselves had to become, you know, migrants or refugees to the United States. It was touching to hear, you know, kind of this dilemma that they were in. They wanted so much to stay in their country and keep telling that story, but they had this constant risk of being imprisoned or being killed. So those journalists make up a very large proportion of the refugees that are here in the United States. And so they're using that opportunity to, you know, put their articles out, expose those human rights abuses here where they're safe to do so. And actually, that was one of the messages that they all brought to that World Press Freedom Day event that we had.
Is that an annual event or?
You know what? This is an event. So it's, I guess, a holiday that was started by the United Nations based on one of the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of course, is the freedom of the press. So they were recognizing the importance of press freedom for human rights around the world. And I think it was, I want to say the 1980s, they created Press Freedom Day, just so it would draw attention to the issues that we're talking about.
Okay.
And it's on, what is that, May
3rd?
3rd. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I looked it up before we started.
I had a quick question for Lisa, if that's okay.
Mhm.
Sure.
Of course.
In regards to Nicaragua, what do you think are the most timely risk factors for journalists? Is it digital security, or what kind of things are you seeing aside from like that are the large, like the more, I guess, attractive attacks to journalists? Is it through digital or is it through physical attacks?
Right now, most all of their independent journalist outlets or media outlets are shut down. I mean, it's really gotten out of control with the government there. Most of those have gone online. Okay. And I think that, you know, there's that opportunity that online media gives us. But I think the most well-known ones, like I mentioned, Juan Lorenzo Holman from La Prensa, he's in jail. This is after he went online. They put La Prensa online. And then on top of that, you've got the special law on cybercrime as well. So it's a tough, I don't think I quite answered your question. What is the worst or the most serious target? I definitely think that the online journalism offers some optimism because it's something that a lot of the Nicaraguan journalists are now doing in the US, and they can, you know, expose the human rights abuses around the world.
Thanks. See, that's what happens when you have all journalists on a panel. They start asking each other questions. You just can't help yourself, right? I appreciate that, though.
Could I ask some questions?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I was just gonna have them answer one more question of mine, and then go to questions. Is that all right?
Cool. Go.
Okay. One of the most timely instances of denial of access to the press that we're seeing right now is going on in Uvalde, you know, of course, where the horrific mass shooting took place. And it's everything from journalists being threatened with trespassing because they were trying to talk to the superintendent of the Uvalde school district, to, I guess, the bikers seem to have been tacitly or not, you know, assisted by the police in blocking cameras from the funerals. And so I know, Katherine, we kind of, you know, talked a little bit about that. So I'd like to get your opinion, and then you guys, and then we can go to questions. By you guys, I mean Lisa and Elle. Sorry. You guys.
Yeah, I cannot imagine what it would be like to have that happen in my community. Just I wanted to preface it by saying that, and the shock and horror that that would undoubtedly create. However, I think it is incredibly problematic when law enforcement, though it is there to serve the best interests of the people, actively tries to make journalists' jobs very difficult when the journalists are trying to both memorialize and inform the public of what actually happened and conduct respectful and thorough investigations into the circumstances of what was a horrific event. Yeah, and I would strongly encourage local and state law enforcement to think about that when they consider their approach and who they ally themselves with in these kind of circumstances. And going forward, hopefully to create an environment in which media is allowed to properly, safely, and freely do their jobs and not add an extra stress to what is an unimaginably difficult situation.
Thanks. Lisa, did you have, or Elle, one of you?
Well, actually, as Katherine was talking, obviously this horrific event that went on, and, you know, Ruth, you were referring to some of the, I guess, silencing of the press. I guess in some ways I take kind of I try to look at the optimistic side. I mentioned earlier that I live in Boca Raton, Florida, which is just adjacent to Parkland. And you might know that area from the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shootings over 2 years ago. One of the things that came out of that, I think more than any other time, you had student activists there that organized, they went online, they became the voices and the journalists. They also got a lot of backlash. But even in Nicaragua, this is what those journalists that have had to escape that bad situation, they're, you know, really trying to, you know, put the word out there, get the truth out there about what's going on. But I was so impressed with those students from Parkland. It's really some of the actions that Amnesty takes as well.
Interesting. Elle?
I think Katherine and Lisa covered it really well. For me, I kind of internalize these moments just because as a journalist, I've covered a lot of these things, right? So for this, thinking of Uvalde and what's happening, and I think about the moment, San Bernardino shootings. I'm from California, and in that process of being a journalist and trying to cover that, if I had the same issues that those that are having right now in Uvalde, I would not be able to do my work properly. And I think it's really important to think about those kinds of things. And I can see that having the distance proximity wise from that location, that it can be difficult to kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together. But I think about also another story that I'm working on in Alabama. And I want to share that with you guys because I think it's important to think about. Just because you're not in close proximity doesn't mean that you can't think about ways where you can take what you're seeing and kind of internalize it within your proximity and see if this is an issue and if there's a way that you can address it. And when I've been working on this story for the last 6 months in Alabama, I found out that in 2020, there was a lawsuit that was brought up in about dash cam and body cams for law enforcement, and how that should be more easily accessible for journalists. And I was floored to find out that that finding or that ruling by the judge was in favor of the police department. So essentially that meant this was going to be a tougher issue for journalists to get information, access to public information from law enforcement, judicial system, everything within Alabama. Right now, as someone that's based out of California, I have to have a journalist that's within Alabama to get basic information that should be already accessible to me. So I think about these kinds of things and in these situations, and as you know, think about in Houston what the situation is and how is this something that could be a possibility, and what can we do to help our community of journalists within there to make sure this doesn't go to a situation where that access to information, which for me in the very beginning, I always mentioned that the access to information is one of the most important elements to our work. And if we don't have that, we're at a, you know, at a lack of operation in a sense.
I agree. I'd like to go to Q&A now. And what I'd like to do is there's one question in the chat that I want to pose. And then if we can all just use the raise hand button, if you all know where it is under reactions, I think then we can just kind of keep it orderly like that. Or if you want to put them in the chat, you can do that as well. But Alex McDonald asks, do our panelists consider Julian Assange a journalist, and what do they think of his situation? Who wants to take that one? Jump right in.
I'll take a stab. We are incredibly concerned about the legal precedent that the DOJ's continued attempts to extradite and prosecute Assange in the United States would have for journalists. The use of the Espionage Act for what is essentially news gathering activity is deeply concerning and would affect everyone, all journalists basically, and to continue in this pursuit, despite all of the kind of warnings from civil society organizations, press freedom organizations, news organizations, is very disheartening. And we strongly encourage the Department of Justice to consider dropping those charges and dropping the extradition case. It does not look like that's going to happen, but it should.
Yeah, we've had some similar cases. I think the Amnesty members here may recall some of the actions surrounding Edward Snowden. We highlighted the Snowden case in our Right for Rights campaign. What was it, about 6 years ago? And also Chelsea Manning as well, kind of similar situation where the US government was very much opposed to what they were putting out there or the information that they were sharing with the public. And yeah, I would agree with Katherine that they should not be prosecuted. That's Amnesty's stance.
I think for me, I stay neutral on a lot of things, and I think it's important to address with, at SPJ, we have a code of ethics, and we have to think about everything that we do and what that means in within that code of ethics, I think. And we always have to, as journalists, think about protecting our sources and how to do so all in a safe manner. So whether Julian Assange is considered a journalist or not, I'm not concerned with that as I am with the access to information and how we can do that in a safe manner.
Got it. Howard, you have a question? Please go ahead.
Yeah, couple. One, particularly with respect to South America and the Central America, is with the change of administrations, is the U.S. intel community becoming more helpful for journalists in both staying alive and getting information and providing them protection? Two, you may feel powerless, but I was reading an Aviation Week article and they made the point that a babushka with a cell phone was more effective militarily sometimes than a communications satellite. So have you considered the use of your technology with body cameras and using them so that when things start to happen to you, immediately it can go onto the net and be used as a way of sort of backing people off? And three, is there anything with AI can provide for international lawyers for representation for people in these various cases to coordinate and helping you? And that's enough. I'll keep my mouth shut. Just listen. Thank you. Yeah.
I guess
I think I could answer the first
okay.
question that Howard
Yeah.
had. I think you were talking about the differences in the U.S. presidential times when it comes to Central America and South America.
Yeah.
There hasn't been too much difference in terms of what is going on inside those countries. There is a difference between our current president and the former one when it comes to refugees, which certainly is related to, the attacks on civilians and journalists, so many who are fleeing for their lives. So definitely.
Yeah.
There was your third question too. I was going to say a quick something about it, and I forgot what your question.
I'm sorry. I was wondering if the use of body cameras and or cell phones for sort of
Okay.
self-tracking and letting people know what's happening to you instantly. You know, I mean, if you're walking along and you're carrying a body camera and you're linked up to the net and something happens to you, or you can show that, you know, the film is, even if the story doesn't get out, you know, in the way you'd want it to get out, the data is going to be on the net, and it's going to be, and people have to consider that when they're talking about an assassination or a, you know, it's very difficult to deny that you had somebody shot if you show up with a U.S. supplied AK-47 or 15 and you shoot the journalist and the journalist is photographing it. That's a lousy deal for you. I understand that, but people knowing that they may be getting into that problem might increase your protection. Might. I'm not, you know, enough said. Yeah.
And I see Catherine is chomping at the bit, I think.
Yeah, can I just jump in
Go.
there on that and say,
Yeah,
I would go
yeah.
back to the summer of 2020 when so many
Yeah.
different things were on camera, and
Yeah.
the ability of rogue individuals or sometimes even state actors to create different narratives about what happened is great. And I think that then forces us would force us to discuss disinformation and the kind of the onslaught of that false narratives have really on public opinion. And I wish it were as simple as just live streaming everything, but that also creates other problems of, you know, source protection to a certain degree. So technology giveth and technology taketh, I suppose.
Thank you.
Are there any questions from the journalists here? All right. Other questions then? Oh, wait, I have, okay, Mohammed, you'll be, Mohammed.
Wait a minute, I concede to Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay.
Okay, I just wanted to know, do you see such, you know, for 4 years, we kept hearing about fake journalism here in the United States. We're talking about the New York Times, the Washington Post, you know, CBS News, whoever, CNN, and it has carried on over here. Do you see a kind of a chilling effect starting to take hold in our society?
I don't know if I can jump in with that, but it would be so nice to say that this problem arose just with the previous president, but he very much like played on something that was already within society. And so unfortunately, a change in administration, it's a change in rhetoric, but not a change in the hearts and minds of people, as I'm sure you guys well know. Unfortunately, it's kind of, it permeates lingo now, right? Like fake news is something that is just kind of tossed out now all the time. I don't see it going away anytime soon. I mean, I'm sure eventually it will be replaced by another catchphrase, as things always are. But I think what it stands for, right, this kind of distrust in media institutions is still very much present, and I think is unfortunately increased by the kind of siloed effect that social media can kind of, the siloing effect, I guess, that social media can create. And yeah, I don't know if this is really answering your question, but I basically, I wish I was more hopeful about this, which is why I'm kind of flip-flopping here, but I don't.
I'd like to piggyback off of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think, I know you mentioned the society, but then I'm kind of recalibrating to what this effect does for journalists that are doing the work. And I can't begin to tell you how in the last minimum 5 years or so, maybe even more, the first question I get asked every time someone asks me if I'm a journalist is, what kind of journalist are you? Are you the fake kind? And the toll that it takes on people that do the job, it's a lot, you know, it's like chipping away little by little. And I can't begin to tell you how important it is to redirect the mental health element of the work that we do. And because at certain point, we were always talking about burnout or just kind of a lot of things happening at once, right? And a lot of things we can't control within our environment, but I think it's really important to think about what this actual toll takes on the people that are doing the work. And because society will always have something to kind of want to chip away at us. It's always going to be a new term. And it's knowing how we can be stronger and to know how to calibrate and have the tools to navigate through it.
Thanks. Yeah, I was called for jury duty a couple months ago, and they ask you all these questions, and so they asked me what I did for a living. I said I'm a journalist, and I could hear people go, it's like. Anyways, Jim, thank you. It's a question from a journalist, wants to know what can we do as US-based journalists to help secure the freedom of captured journalists like Austin Tice? And then Alex, I'll come to you next. So any of you want to take that question?
I don't mind starting because we're part of SBJ. One thing you can do is we always, in situations like this, we always do press releases as a part of the international community for things that are happening abroad. And that's something that we do. We bring attention to it and we bring a larger attention to it. We don't provide resources, but we always partner with our collaborators like at CPJ or Freedom of the Press Association and Frontline Freelance, other organizations that are actually having the resources to draw attention to subjects like this and matters like this. I think it's really important when we have situations like this, we all come together. And just to let you know that the international community hopefully is that go-to element of SPJ that you can, if you see an international situation, that there is a place that you can go to be a part of it.
I would also just say, kind of, piggybacking off of that, like make sure you're distributing different press releases from different organizations, but also if you feel so moved to do so, contact your local and state and federal representatives and let them know you care. It's a big, important thing.
Alex, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting panel discussion. I'm sort of feeling that we're in very detailed on a number of aspects for journalists. And I would love to sort of have a bigger picture from your perspective of how journalism has changed and where journalists today, I mean, with the consolidation of a lot of the media, for example, in the United States, the closing down, I've heard that the number of journalists has dropped significantly. There's a lot of loss of local news from what I understand. And so I'm curious, and yet there are these new things. There are, people doing podcasts and doing their own thing. And so I'm trying to understand the ecosystem of journalism and where do you all see journalism moving, the opportunities for the public to get good information. My kids get their news off of Reddit, and so I'm just sort of trying to understand what should we be looking, instead of just looking at the world from the rear view mirror. I'm curious what you all see out the windshield. Thank you.
So who wants to take that one? Nobody.
I mean, it's a very loaded question. I mean, think of lots of different things. I don't know what the future holds for, I can only focus on my career, and that's the only thing I can think about that I could speak truthfully to. And for starting out, I always wanted to have a place within legacy organizations. And that to me was a level of metric of success. And at a certain place, I was able to get into National Geographic, New York Times, all different places that I probably didn't imagine would happen to me in a lifetime. However, after reaching those goals, I realized there are new ways of sharing information, different methods of storytelling that I could do. And as long as I keep to my ethical code, that is what a journalist does, I can do different types of work. Like, for example, I did an investigation with New York Times last year. I'm planning on turning it into a documentary, because I know as an audience, people will probably see my content more than they would read it. And I think it's really important to think about who's your audience, and are you capable of bringing those stories, those important stories and that truth to them in that medium? And are you willing to explore that? I think we're going through a phase right now of social media, of like Twitter, Instagram. Imagine during the pandemic, we were going through a phase, like we had one of our IC talks that we did was with someone that's a social media expert with BuzzFeed World. And to think that people that year 2020 were consuming everything off of Instagram stories, infographics that were then becoming very popular on Instagram. And there was someone that was an executive producer for CBS News. He ended up going on Instagram, and now is a couple of years later, we had him when he had 5,000 followers, and he came onto our IC Talk and now has over hundreds of thousands of followers and has turned into a brand of, giving out information via social media.
Yeah.
And he was doing news on CBS Morning News, right? So I think being open to different forms of sharing that information, you're essentially doing the same things in your ethical code and your practice. It's, I think what's changing or making people recalibrate is maybe they're not reading as much, or maybe they want to see something more consumed. I think it's really important to think about who your audience is in that way. Because essentially you want more people consuming the hard work that you do.
Thanks. We're just about at the end. So, Katherine and Lisa, 20 seconds. Go ahead. Can't do it in, okay, 30 seconds.
Well, I guess I was thinking about another key importance of journalists. Ruth, you had told everyone about the asylum work that I do. When Nicaraguans are escaping that dangerous situation and they go before an immigration judge and they're trying to make their case, this is why it's dangerous. Without someone narrating that danger, even that becomes difficult. So I had that on my mind because I just did a testimony for an asylum case today, and thinking about how much I depend on journalists to give me that information.
All right. And Katherine?
Yeah, sorry, I was actually just looking at my Post-it notes up here that I kind of write for myself ahead of time, just to make sure that I conveyed just how bad this year thus far has been for journalists. 37, we're investigating 37 total cases of journalists being killed so far this year. We have 21 confirmed cases. And so the kind of highest rates are in Ukraine and Mexico. And that's just this year. Those are pushing the numbers that we had from last year, even total, right? However, to end on a more hopeful note, kind of going off one of the questions, right? The profession is evolving. People are finding different ways to tell stories. Journalism, as we used to know it, is changing in new ways, and people will continue to want to seek information, and hopefully with work, the world will become a slightly safer place for reporters to continue in their profession. So.
Well said. Thank you. Thanks to all of our speakers. This was really enlightening. So I will throw it back to Mohammed. I believe you're going to close out.
Yeah, I just
Mohammed, Howard Law. They were asking for a general picture of some of this stuff. There was a book that was put up about 10 years ago called "They Tell Me This Is the Way the World Ends" by Nicole Perth of the New York Times. And I would really urge you to read it, because all of the technology questions that you're talking about, she was beginning to identify. The use of body cameras, the failure to track properly the computers, and her having to get into this thing for the first time. She had the only office in the New York Times that was sealed off from outside viewing because they were afraid the intelligence agencies would be tracking what they were saying
Thank
on
you,
the
Howard.
computers.
That's-
Enough to said. Enough said.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's important. Go ahead.
Yeah. Enough said. Sorry.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you, Elle and Catherine and Lisa for this. I mean, the information that you guys talked about went from so many different areas. It's really amazing, and I know there's several folks who could not make it. They're waiting for the recording of this meeting. So thank you so much for joining us, and for everyone else. Our next meeting, we meet on the first Monday of each month at the same time. But in July, the first Monday is on 4th of July. So our meeting will most likely be the following Monday on July 11th. Okay. All right. So thank you.
I have a question. Are
Yes.
we not doing a drawing for a gift certificate?
Oh yeah, Bob, do you have your bowl of?
Not that I'm hoping to win or anything. You're muted, Bob.
I'm so sorry. I might leave y'all for this. Thank you guys so
I
much.
don't have a
Okay,
bowl.
thank
I'm
you,
sorry.
Catherine, so
Thank
much.
you,
Sorry.
Catherine.
Think
Bye.
about it.
Sorry.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. I know Elle has to leave too. So,
All right.
Yeah. Likewise. Thank you so much for having me, everyone.
Thank you.
oh, thank you.
Thanks for your
Bye-bye.
patience with our questions.
So Bob, I think you should have that bowl ready every meeting.
Yeah, you have to forgive me. You'll have to find me. Kick me out of the country. Send me to Canada, where it's really getting bad up there.
Yeah. Go to Diane's
That's right. We're going to
cottage
my
in Toronto.
relatives. We'll form a caravan.
Get you out of the country.
So y'all take care. I'll try to do better next month. About our
God
book.
bless.
So,
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you guys for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mohammed.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Mohammed,
Okay,
thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Send us a copy.
Bye. Bye, Louisa.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.